Imagine going on a simple camping trip with friends, expecting laughter around the campfire and fun stories, but ending up trapped in a nightmare you'll never forget. Sounds coming from nowhere, footprints around the tent, shadows moving between the trees, and worst of all, something out there calling your name. This isn't just a horror story. This really happened. And if you think you've heard scary stories, wait until you hear this one. But be careful. After this video, you may never want to camp again. If you like mysteries and chilling real stories, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and come with me, if you dare. It all started with a simple idea. A weekend away from the city, surrounded only by nature and the starry sky. Daniel, Marcos, Carol, and Julia had been friends for years, and with the rush of everyday life, they almost never had time to get together like before. It was then that Marcos suggested something different. What if we camped in Serra das Almas? They say the view from there is incredible, and there's a perfect river for swimming. The idea seemed perfect. A secluded place, away from noise and pollution, where they could relax and forget about their problems. Julia was excited, but hesitated a little. I heard that forest has some strange stories. People who get lost, lights in the trees. Marcos laughed. Ah, Julia, you believe in everything. It's just a trail in the middle of the woods. There's nothing much to it. Daniel, always practical, took out his cell phone and researched. Well, it seems safe. We just need to follow the main trail and avoid straying from the group. Convinced, they started planning everything: tents, food, flashlights, a small first aid kit. They even took a radio to guarantee communication, since the cell phone signal was weak in that region. On Friday afternoon, they loaded the car with equipment and left. The sun was shining brightly, and the weather was perfect for the adventure. Along the way, they laughed, made jokes, and commented on how incredible that weekend would be. What they didn't know was that they wouldn't be alone in that forest. After a few hours on the road, the car entered a dirt road, surrounded by tall, dense trees. The air there felt different, colder, more humid, and an eerie silence took over the room. The sound of the car engine was the only noise cutting through the suffocating stillness of that forest. It feels like we're in the middle of nowhere, Carol commented, looking out the window. Exactly as we planned, Marcos replied with a smile. Complete peace. The group reached the point where they needed to walk to the campsite. The map indicated a walk of approximately 30 minutes along the main trail. They adjusted their backpacks, grabbed their flashlights, and began hiking, feeling the excitement of the adventure. However, as they advanced, something began to feel off. The forest seemed too closed, as if the trees were bending over them slightly. The smell of wet earth and rotting leaves was intense, and the silence remained disturbing. No bird sounds, no crickets, nothing but the rustle of leaves underfoot. It was Julia who noticed it first. Have you noticed that since we entered here, we haven't heard a single animal sound? Daniel looked around. Now that you mention it, strange indeed. Marcos, trying to relax, shrugged. Maybe the animals are taking a nap. They continued walking, but that uncomfortable feeling didn't leave them. A few minutes later, Carol suddenly stopped and pointed to a fallen log on the side of the trail. There was someone here, she said, picking up an object from the floor. It was a red scarf, a little dirty with dirt, but clearly left behind by someone. What's wrong with that? Asked Marcos. It's a little wet, and it has a strange smell, Carol replied, wrinkling her nose. Daniel took the tissue and sniffed it. His face became serious. This smells like iron, like blood. A shiver ran through the group. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the forest, like a branch breaking under a heavy weight. They looked at each other. Probably an animal, Marcos tried to say, but his voice no longer sounded so confident. They decided to hurry up and head to the planned campsite. However, none of them noticed that, hidden among the trees, something or someone was watching them closely. The group finally arrived at the chosen campsite. It was a spacious clearing, surrounded by huge trees that seemed to watch their every move. The nearby river murmured softly, cutting through the oppressive silence of the forest. The sky was already turning purple and orange when they started setting up the tents. Marcos lit the fire, and soon the comforting heat of the flames chased away some of the cold that was settling in the air. Little by little, the laughter returned, and conversations flowed like on any other trip. Julia opened a bag of marshmallows and began to roast one over the fire. Now real camp, as she said, trying to break the tension that still lingered since the strange walk, but the discomfort didn't take long to return. The wind began to howl through the trees, strong enough to sway the dry branches and make ghostly shadows dance around the campfire. Somewhere further away in the woods, a dull noise echoed, like a branch breaking under a considerable weight. Carol looked in the direction of the sound. "Did you hear that?" Daniel nodded, swallowing hard. "It could be an animal. Or someone else," murmured Julia. The fire crackled, sending small sparks into the air. Suddenly, a loud crack came from behind the tents. Everyone turned around at the same time. Nothing, just the dense darkness of the forest. Marcos laughed nervously. "Okay, someone wants to scare me, is that it?" The group looked at each other. Nobody was kidding. It was then that Carol noticed something strange. The shadows the flames cast felt wrong. Some seemed to move independently, as if they had a life of their own. "Guys, I think we should go into the tents," Carol suggested, her voice shaking. The idea seemed good. One by one they retreated. The fire was still burning, casting light and heat against the growing night. But even inside the tents, the feeling of restlessness did not disappear. Outside, the wind whispered through the leaves, and with each gust, it seemed to bring with it an almost human sound, like a whisper or a distant laugh. The dawn advanced, slowly and silently. The cold of the forest intensified, and the only constant sound was the crackle of the fire that still burned outside. Inside the tents, the group tried to sleep, but the uncomfortable feeling of being watched prevented true rest. Carol was the first to wake up. Or rather, she was awakened by a sound. A slow, rhythmic rustling, as if something was moving among the dry leaves. She remained motionless, with her eyes wide open in the dark of the tent, trying to understand if this was part of a dream or if it was real. It was then that she heard it clearly. Footsteps. They were not coming from the direction of the friends' tents, but from a further point, on the edge of the camp, where the light from the fire could no longer reach. The sound approached with calculated slowness, as if whoever was there knew exactly how to instill fear. Carol held her breath. She mustered the courage to unzip the tent, just enough to peer outside. The fire was weaker now, just embers faintly lighting the ground, but it was enough for her to see. Footprints. They were scattered around the tents, imprinted in the damp earth, but something was wrong, very wrong. They were barefoot footprints, large, deformed, and wet, as if they had been left by someone who had just climbed out of a river. The most disturbing detail, some seemed to start out of nowhere, as if that thing had simply appeared there. Carol covered her mouth with her hand to keep from screaming. She turned to call Marcos, but before she could do anything, a sound cut through the silence, a whisper, low, distorted, coming from the darkness of the forest. And then, a laugh. It wasn't human. Dread took over her. She threw herself back and zipped up the tent as quickly as she could, shaking from head to toe. Outside, the footsteps continued, surrounding the camp. The silence was suffocating. Carol was still inside the tent, shaking, trying to convince herself that this was just a figment of her imagination. But the footsteps, they continued, slow, circular, as if they were analyzing the group. Outside, Marcos had also woken up. He didn't know why, but he felt a strange sensation, as if something was calling him. Without really understanding what was happening, he unzipped the tent and peeked outside. The fire had almost gone out, with only a faint glow remaining in the embers. It was then that he heard it, a voice, low, almost a whisper, coming from the trees deeper in the forest. Frames. His blood ran cold. It was a call, and the most disturbing thing was that the voice was identical to her mother's. He was paralyzed. His mother was miles away, at home, sleeping peacefully. That didn't make sense. He looked around. Everyone seemed to be asleep except Carol, who was now peeking out from inside the tent, her eyes wide with fear. Marcos, come here. This time the voice came from closer. Something was approaching. Marcos felt a shiver run up his spine. His body told him to run, to hide, but his mind seemed seduced by the call. It was as if something inside him needed to obey. He stood up, feet sinking into the cold earth of the forest. With each step, his heart beat faster, but his movement seemed not to be his own. He didn't want to go, but he was going. It was only when Carol screamed his name that he woke up. "Frames! What are you doing?" He blinked a few times, confused. It was at the edge of the camp. I didn't remember walking there. As he looked ahead, into the forest, his eyes tried to find something in the shadows. And then he saw it. Two silhouettes, tall, thin, standing between the trees. The bodies were as dark as the night itself, and the eyes glowed. Not like an animal's eyes reflecting light, but with their own intense, yellowish glow. Marcos swallowed. He couldn't explain it, but they were smiling, and then, in perfect synchronization, the silhouettes took a step forward. Marcos remained motionless, his body paralyzed by fear. The silhouettes in the forest were still there, watching, waiting, smiling. A cold wind passed through the trees, bringing with it a distant sound, an echo carried by time. It was then that Carol whispered, "We need to get into the tent, now." Marcos hesitated, but took a step back, then another, and then ran into the camp. They locked themselves in the tent, holding their breath, listening to every slightest sound outside. But what was most frightening was the absolute silence that followed. Nothing, no crickets, no leaves moving, nothing. "This isn't right," muttered Daniel, now awake, trying to understand the fear on his friends' faces. Carol, still shaking, whispered, "What if it's like the case of the missing climber?" The tension in the air grew even heavier. Nobody said anything, but everyone knew that story. About 2 years earlier, a man named Andre Costa, an experienced climber, had disappeared in this same region of the forest. He was accompanied by 3 friends on a climbing expedition, but one night he simply disappeared without a trace. The searches lasted weeks, sniffer dogs, specialized teams. Nothing, no sign of Andre. But what made everything even more macabre was the report from his friends. On the last night before his disappearance, Andre started acting strangely. He said he heard someone calling his name in the forest. The voice was just like his late grandfather's. He even tried to ignore it, but he became increasingly restless. "There's someone outside calling me. I need to go." His friends tried to hold him back, to convince him that it wasn't real, but in the middle of the night he left the tent and never came back. "Do you remember what the firefighters found?" asked Carol with a low voice. "Yes," Daniel murmured, swallowing hard. The only trace of Andre was found 3 weeks later. A group of scouts who were passing along the highest trail on the mountain saw their clothes folded and piled on a rock, but Andre wasn't there. Police believed he might have fallen into a ravine, but no body was ever found. No bones, no trace of blood, just the folded clothes And one detail that made everything even stranger. His sneakers were intact. How would someone disappear in the middle of the forest, completely barefoot, without any marks on the ground? The case became a mystery, and after a while, the government closed the investigations, but local residents still talked about it. There were those who believed that Andre was taken by something that lives in the forest, something that calls people by name, something that waits for the right moment to get them. Inside the tent, everyone was silent. The story of the missing climber now seemed closer than ever, and then outside, a voice whispered, "Marcos, come here." The voice outside whispered Marcos's name, dragging out the syllables as if he took pleasure in pronouncing them. It was low, hoarse. But the scariest thing was that it sounded familiar. He held his breath, feeling his heart race inside his chest. None of the friends dared to speak. The silence inside the tent was as heavy as the pitch-black forest outside. Then something touched the tent zipper. "Don't move," Daniel whispered, almost inaudible. The sound was faint, as if someone was testing the fabric's strength by dragging a cold finger over the nylon. And suddenly, it stopped. Seconds passed, minutes, maybe an eternity, until a crack broke the silence. "Crack!" Carol held back a scream with her hand over her mouth. Everyone looked at the small pile of belongings in the center of the tent. The flashlight that Daniel had left next to the sleeping bag was now in the other corner of the tent. "How?" Carol muttered, swallowing hard. Nobody had moved, none of them had touched her. But there was the lantern lying on the other side, as if someone had pushed it. "That's not possible," Daniel whispered, grabbing his own arm. Carol took the flashlight with shaking hands and placed it back in the same place. They watched, waiting, hoping it was just an error in perception. But then, before his eyes, the lantern rolled by, itself once again. "That's not possible," Marcos whispered, panic growing. He slowly reached out and took the flashlight. His heart was pounding, but he needed to test something. He held on tight, mentally counting to 10. If it were the wind, if it were some unevenness, the lantern wouldn't be able to move now. Time passed slowly, absolute silence. Then, without any warning, the flashlight was violently snatched from his hand and thrown out of the tent. Carol screamed. Daniel held his breath. Marcos felt his blood run cold in his veins. Something, or someone, was out there. And that wanted them to know. The silence after what happened was unbearable. No one could find a logical explanation for what had happened to the lantern. Marcos, Daniel, and Carol looked at each other, hoping that someone would have the courage to say something that would ease the tension. But nobody said anything. It was then that they realized. "Where's Felipe?" Carol asked, looking around. "He was there a few minutes ago, wasn't he?" Marcos looked at the place where Felipe was supposed to be lying inside the tent, but all he found was his empty sleeping bag. "Felipe?" Daniel called, his voice trembling. No response. Carol pulled the zipper of the tent violently and looked outside. The cold, early morning air made his skin crawl. The bonfire, which had previously burned brightly, was now just a pile of smoldering embers. "Felipe!" Marcos shouted, already getting up. Nothing. No sound, no movement. Just the darkness of the forest swallowing everything around. The flashlight that had been thrown outside was lying on the ground, pointed at the trees. A few meters away, there were footprints in the soft earth, footprints that went into the forest. "He must have gone to the bathroom," Daniel suggested, but his voice didn't show confidence. Marcos took the flashlight and followed the footprints with his eyes. What he saw made his stomach turn. The marks started near the tent, but then they just disappeared. There were no footprints coming back. Felipe went into the woods and never came out again. "That doesn't make sense," Marcos murmured. Approaching the edge of the trail, "Felipe, stop kidding, that's not funny," Carol shouted, her voice full of despair. The wind whispered through the leaves, but there was no response. No sign of Felipe, no sound of branches breaking, nothing. Daniel tried to call Felipe's cell phone, but no call went through. The signal was completely gone, as if the forest had swallowed any trace of contact with the outside world. "We need to look for him," Marcos said, determined. "Now, in the middle of the night. What if something happened to him?" Carol held Marcos' arm, her eyes wide with fear. Daniel looked at the tent, at the footprints, at the flashlight thrown on the ground. None of this made sense. Felipe would never leave alone without warning, even more so after what had happened with the flashlight. And it was then that Carol realized something even more terrifying. Guys, his sleeping bag is cold. They looked at each other, not understanding. "What? Felipe's sleeping bag? It should be hot, right? He left recently, but it isn't." Marcos touched the fabric. It was freezing, as if no one had slept there that night. Dread took over them. Felipe had not only disappeared, but it looked like he had never been there. The silence of the forest was overwhelming. No sounds of crickets, no rustling of leaves in the wind. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Marcos, Carol, and Daniel continued to stand still, looking at Felipe's cold sleeping bag. He was gone. The footprints extended into the woods, but then disappeared, as if he had been erased. "We need to do something," Daniel said, trying to remain calm. "But what to do? Look for him in the dark." Carol replied, her eyes wide, her breathing shallow. "We can't just wait," Marcos countered. "Something happened to him. Every second counts." It was then that they realized a thick fog was beginning to form between the trees. It appeared slowly, like a ghostly curtain creeping across the forest floor, swallowing everything around. Carol instinctively backed away. "This wasn't here before," he murmured. The air suddenly turned cold, and a strange sensation ran down the three spines. Marcos's flashlight began to blink. The battery was full. It shouldn't be failing. It was at that moment that they saw it. In the midst of the fog, dark shapes began to move. At first, they were just distant silhouettes, long, distorted shadows that seemed to glide between the trees. Then they approached. Marcos felt his throat dry up. Daniel squeezed Carol's arm, as if that could protect them. "Who's there?" Marcos shouted, trying to sound firm. The answer came in the form of a whisper, low, drawn out, like a wind carrying words that didn't make sense. A strange guttural language. The shadows stopped. They stood there motionless, watching. The mist swirled around them, as if they were controlling their own environment. Little by little, they began to take shape. And then, in the thick mist, a larger silhouette appeared. She didn't walk. It floated. Daniel tried to move, but his muscles felt trapped. He felt something inside his mind, a suffocating sensation, as if something was looking inside him. "Run," Carol shouted, pulling them both. The three of them dashed down the trail, stumbling over the damp ground and gnarled roots. The mist seemed alive, crawling behind them, bringing those shadows with it. But before they left the clearing, Marcos looked back. For a brief second, he saw Felipe standing in the fog. His eyes were completely black, and then darkness swallowed him. The three ran without looking back, their hearts racing as if each beat was a countdown to something horrible. The air was thick, heavy, filled with a strange smell, a mixture of wet earth and iron. The mist didn't retreat. It followed them, crawling along the trail like invisible fingers trying to grab them. Daniel tripped over a root and fell hard to the ground. Marcos and Carol helped him get up quickly, but at that moment, they noticed something scary. They were no longer on the trail. The surrounding forest had changed. The trees looked older, twisted as if they were suffering. Their dry branches resembled deformed hands trying to grasp them. The silence was absolute. No sounds of insects, no rustling of leaves, just the accelerated sound of your own breaths. It was Carol who saw it first. "My God, what is that?" His voice came out as a shaky whisper. In front of them, partially hidden among the trees, was a circle of ancient stones covered in dark moss. In the center, a stone altar, stained with something dark and dry. Strange symbols were engraved around it, carved into the stone and also into the dirt floor, forming a perfect circle. "This seems like a ritual," Daniel muttered, his face pale. There were unlit candles scattered around, and in the middle of the altar, something that looked like a bloody piece of cloth. But it wasn't just that. Behind the altar, there were stakes driven into the ground, each holding something held together by rotten ropes. Bones. "This isn't recent," Marcos whispered, touching one of the stones. "She was hot." Carol took a step back, her stomach dropping. It was then that they heard it. A low sound, a murmur coming from the forest. The shadows were there, observing. The fog slowly moved around the altar as if it were alive, and then a sound of something dragging across the floor echoed around them. "We need to get out of here," Carol said, her voice barely audible. But before they could run, something happened. All the surrounding candles lit up at the same time. The blue flame illuminated the circle of stones, revealing something that made the three's blood run cold. Fresh footprints in the damp earth, as if someone or something had just walked around them. Footprints that started but didn't end anywhere. The blue flames of the candles flickered, casting distorted shadows around the altar. The wind whispered through the twisted trees, but that whisper was not just the sound of the wind. "Who's there?" Marcos asked, his voice breaking at the end. Silence. Daniel stared blankly at the altar, unable to move. Carol was pale, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she tried to contain her panic. None of them wanted to be the first to turn their backs on that macabre scene. It was then that they heard it, a sound that made the air become heavy, difficult to breathe, a voice, low, dragged, coming out of the trees. "You shouldn't be here." Time stopped. Carol squeezed Marcos's hand, her entire body shaking. Daniel felt his legs become weak, as if they would collapse at any moment. The voice wasn't theirs, but it was familiar. It was as if someone was imitating one of their friends' voices, but in the wrong way. The sound echoed again, closer. "You shouldn't be here." "It's my voice," Daniel murmured, feeling his heart leap in his chest. Carol and Marcos looked at each other in pure terror. It was true. The voice was identical to Daniel's, but distorted, wrong, as if someone or something was trying to copy and failing. Suddenly, a twig broke in the darkness. Something was moving through the trees, getting closer. Fear turned to despair. Carol held Daniel's arm and whispered, "Run, and now." But before they could react, the voice sounded again, now right behind them. "I'm already here." They turned around at the same time, their hearts in their throats, and that's when they saw it. Something moved in the mist, something that was shaped like a human. But it wasn't human, and he had Daniel's face. As they advanced through the forest, the fog seemed to grow even thicker. The silence was absolute, except for the sound of their footsteps on the damp earth. "That doesn't seem right," Carol muttered, holding the flashlight tighter. Daniel, who was ahead, suddenly stopped. "Do you see this?" Marcos and Carol approached, looking where he was pointing. In the surrounding trees, there were symbols carved into the wood. There were strange geometric shapes, spirals and figures that looked like eyes watching from all angles. "Who would do that in the middle of the forest?" Marcos asked, touching one of the carvings. The wood looked worn, as if the symbols had been there for many years. "Maybe it's something from ancient explorers, or someone who camps around here," suggested Carol, trying to remain calm. But as she looked closer, she noticed something that made her catch her breath. One of the symbols resembled a human silhouette, and next to her, another smaller figure. As if representing someone disappearing into the darkness, a shiver ran down his spine. Let's get out of here. Now, without arguing, the three quickened their pace, trying to ignore the strange feeling that they were not alone on that trail. Carol's heart beat wildly, as if it were trying to escape her own chest. The feeling of being watched was suffocating. The cold wind howled through the trees, and every shadow cast by the lantern seemed to hide something or someone. "Run!" Daniel shouted, pulling Carol by the arm. Marcos was already racing ahead, trampling dry leaves and twisted branches. They didn't know what was behind them, but they knew they couldn't stop. The sound of footsteps echoed in the darkness. But the worst part was that they didn't know if those footsteps were just theirs or someone else running behind them. Carol stumbled, falling to her knees on the muddy ground. "Get up, Carol! For the love of God, get up!" Marcos shouted, taking a few steps back. The flashlight rolled away, spinning on the ground and illuminating something in the trees. A figure, rigid, high, observing. Daniel didn't think twice and pulled her tightly, helping her to her feet. Time seemed distorted. Every second lasted an eternity. "There, I see the trail!" Marcos pointed to a small light between the trees. But then, a sound cut through the silence. Whispers. Low, intense, as if dozens of voices were murmuring at the same time. "Don't stop! Don't stop!" Carol screamed, ignoring the pain in her legs and the burning in her lungs. The smell of wet earth was strong, and the dense fog made everything even more confusing. With each step, they felt the ground becoming heavier, as if something was trying to hold them there. The clearing was just a few meters away. If they got there, maybe they would be safe. But it was then that Marcos let out a terrified scream. They turned around in time to see his legs being pulled back, as if invisible hands were trying to drag him back into the forest. "Help me!" Daniel and Carol threw themselves at him, grabbing his arms. They pulled with all their might. Marcos kicked desperately, trying to free himself from whatever was trying to take him. With one last effort, they managed to pull him back onto the path. Without looking back, the three took off down the trail, their lungs burning and terror coursing through their blood. As they crossed the clearing, silence took over the environment. The whispers stopped. The wind stopped. They were finally safe. Or at least, that's what they thought. The sky was already starting to lighten when the three finally saw the dirt road that led to the parking lot where they had left the car. His legs were shaking, his lungs were burning, and his eyes still reflected the terror of the previous night. But they were alive. They had managed to get out of that nightmare. "Never again. I'll never come back here again." Carol panted, leaning on the car, trying to catch her breath. Daniel unlocked the doors with shaking hands, barely able to hold the keys. Marcos, still in shock, sat in the passenger seat, holding his head in his hands. Whatever happened in that forest? It wasn't normal. The car took off, kicking up dust on the road as they fled that place as if hell itself was behind them. With each kilometer covered, the feeling of persecution diminished, but the fear remained etched in the skin. It wasn't until they finally arrived in town and stopped at a gas station that they began to process everything. "We need to tell someone," Carol suggested, still pale. "Tell what? That we were persecuted by something we didn't even know what it was? That we heard whispers and saw shadows in the fog? They'll call us crazy." Daniel replied, staring at the steering wheel. Marcos remained silent, staring at the window. He knew something else had happened. It was only when he looked at his legs, already illuminated by the dawn light, that he realized. Brands. On the skin of his ankles were finger marks, as if invisible hands had actually tried to drag him into the forest. What it was, Carol asked, noticing her friend's glazed look. Slowly, he looked up at the two of them. "We weren't the first." Carol and Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Marcos swallowed hard, his heart racing again. He opened his backpack, pulled out his cell phone, and started searching for the trail name. When he found a link to an old forum, his eyes widened. He turned the screen to his friends. Group missing on Shadowdale Trail. Last known location, camp near cliff. No trace found. The posting date, exactly 10 years before that night. Silence took over the car. Now they understood. The forest had taken other people before, and somehow, that night, she decided to let them go. But why, or even worse? Until when? The three friends never returned to that forest. They never spoke about that night to anyone other than themselves, but the mystery remained. What if that thing is still there, waiting, choosing your next victim? Perhaps, in some remote corner of the world, there are places that should not be explored. Places where the rules of reality bend and something unnameable watches, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And now, I ask you, would you have the courage to camp in a deserted forest? If this story gave you goosebumps, leave a like and comment below if you have ever experienced something inexplicable like this. And if you like scary stories like this, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because there's a lot more horror coming. But be careful. Some stories are real. Good night, if you can sleep.